He introduced me to Frank Motek at the inaugural event that was at Trump that a bunch of us attended, and got the opportunity to meet you, and he was very kind to agree to come and speak to our group. So we thought, okay, we've got a business flavor, and then I started talking to Des about it. And you know Des Myers, you know, she has, I mean, just for all of us, she's educated all of us so much on so many different topics. And I will tell you today, she's going to do the same thing again, and she's going to be a great opener for Frank. So I'd like to introduce Des Myers.
Okay, so Claudia pointed out there's a newsletter, Preserve PVE, written here. It focuses on the city of Palos Verdes Estates, which we're in right now, but it applies to more than just our city. And in the newsletter that just went out, we have been told in writing from our city council that our fire hydrants had been tested, by the way. And what I did was I went ahead and posted on Nextdoor an email this council had received from the fire department in 2021, admitting that the fire hydrants have not been tested for over a decade and would not be tested moving forward. You are not being told this, but it is in writing. So if you want to subscribe, a lot of what's being reported, especially about safety, is applicable to the whole hill and beyond. So that's what we do. We do investigation and reporting at a level you don't see in many other compromised reporting structures that are out there, and you guys sense that. And what you're seeing is you're seeing these mom and pop and more local reporting because people are out there saying, wait a minute, this isn't true, and they're not tied to anybody else. Let me get on to the presentation. This is just kind of a warm-up to Frank's speech. So here's the presentation. And what I did was I started at the macro level for part one. And if you'd like, we can come back and talk about more at the city level and the state level more later. But this talks about what's happening federally. And what is this DOGE? Why do we need DOGE? Okay, so let's define some terminology here. So this is what's happening at the federal government. And let's define what a deficit is. So right now, what we have, and we're looking at 2025, is you've got $5 trillion in revenue, but they're planning on spending their budget $2 trillion more, so $7 trillion in expenditures. That creates a $2 trillion deficit. Go ahead. So deficits are funded by either reserves, meaning your savings account, or by debt, by the federal government. In the federal government's case, they don't have reserves, so it's always by debt. So our debt grows. So the Fed has no reserves. So the question is, a lot of times you hear the government saying, hey, we're going to expand the economy by creating this great new government project and hiring all these people to work for the government. Do you guys know? Which column does that go in? That's consumption. That makes it worse. That does not improve the economy. It's the private sector that grows this over here. And this is where we need the growth. So when they say, hey, we're going to expand the economy, they're not being honest with you by creating more government projects. So here we have our debt. Our debt is at $37.5 trillion. It's actually larger if you include the unfunded amount that we have in Social Security and Medicare and other places. We'll get to that later. But this is $37.5 trillion, which is enough to operate several other countries. This is your $5 trillion over here in revenue. And now you see this $2 trillion in deficit, and when we don't pay it, what happens? We throw it on here. So a deficit is 1 year of spending, whether you're plus or minus for the year. And you start over at the next year. But that accumulates, and that's what creates your debt. All right, so let's look at our debt over time. So now you're looking at 1951 over here, and this is 2021. What you're looking at, believe it or not, this was actually Clinton did pretty good around here, and then you get into the Obama years, it starts growing, and then we had quite a bit of growth during Trump, but Biden, this. You look at this and where it is here, this is 2021, and 2 years, look where it grew. Wow. This is called theft. This is somebody, this isn't just a little bit of money. Somebody created something here and it's orchestrated. This is a lot. And again, this excludes Social Security and Medicare payments, and I say that because I think it's going to be targeted one day if we don't do something. So here's your debt, and you can see the interest, it just goes and it gets added to the expense. And now you can see interest is becoming the cause of our deficits, which then becomes a cause of debt. Go ahead. And that becomes an endless cycle of your deficit for $2 trillion. One of it is just interest, and now you're in a spiral. And then it becomes out of control. People in America don't understand how critical it is to fix this situation. We are being destabilized. So let's take a look at what Doge's problem is that they're trying to solve. It's pretty difficult. If you look at how much money we spend of that $7 trillion, here's a breakout in 10 categories. Compulsory means you have to do it. Now, Social Security, that's the highest at $1.5 trillion. And then you go through all these, and most of them are compulsory. So you don't have a lot to give. So I went at it just aggressively and said, okay, let's have health, we take out $200 billion. Let's say transportation, we take out a little bit here, but we're short infrastructure. Because remember, they have not been putting that money into infrastructure for our transportation, which they should have been. That money's disappearing. Let's say they wipe out the education department, which they said they have. That's really a responsibility of the state. And we go after just other. Well, we're short even $1 trillion here. So how are they going to solve that problem? So options to address our fiscal descent. We can increase revenue. Trump says he's going to do that by 4% annual increase. We have Doge looking at eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. That's actually a huge category. That's where you can reduce all those categories with the volume that he's finding. He said he's going to find $2 trillion. That's not a mistake. Did you see that correlated to the amount of the deficit? Trump said he will not go after Social Security and Medicare. I believe him, but I worry about people that come after him. And that's why we've got to make whatever changes we do permanent. Getting rid of optional spending, things that aren't important, as well as efficiency. That'll be part of what Doge is looking at. But of course, what do when they don't have enough money? They print more money. But what does that mean? That means they devalue the dollars that you do have. And that's why we get inflation. They keep spreading out, and that harms us all the most. But this is what he's trying to do, is to bring in more revenue without increasing taxes. All right, so here we see the deficit for the deficit. He's trying to do away with that with Doge. He says he's going to bring in 4% growth, but actually he's aiming for a heck of a lot more. You can see that's not going to have a lot. I mean, obviously that's a little bit of a surplus for $200 billion, but we're going to need more to get out of this. But at least we can stop the descent. The good thing is, when you look at how bad our decisions are on our dollars, all the other countries are doing it too. It kind of saves us. Their bad decisions, which is why many of them still stay on using the dollar as a form of currency. But the problem is most Americans don't understand this. So when you hear them lamenting about, we can't lose all those jobs, there's 2.5 million people that work for the federal government. No, we can't afford to keep them. When they say, hey, we can afford to pay for all these other countries and everything that they want, we actually can't. There's an impact here. And when people understand this, and I wish people did, people outside of this room, then they realize how critical this is for our stability. Because we're not going to be able to help anybody if we're not alive. So here's where I think they're going to end up, a bad government, if we don't fix this. It's going to be after Social Security and Medicare. So Social Security was initially created with the promise that your money and the money your employer is paying, putting aside for you, is going to be available for you in the future. But as time passed, they changed the laws. And they started paying for people who didn't pay in, that are not citizens. It's for disability. Fine, whatever those decisions are, I think we could all agree that shouldn't come out of Medicare. If anything, it should come out of another bucket. And so they have something called the Social Security Trust Fund, but they are now taking more money out, the payouts, than money that's coming in. That reserve is being depleted. But unlike government pensions, which is actual money that's been reserved for a person, our Social Security can be legally reduced or eliminated. And so can Medicare. This is why the government doesn't include the cost of Social Security and Medicare in the debt. Because they're saying, but we can do away with that obligation anytime we want to. So here's what it looks like, Medicare and Social Security. This is how much money is coming in. We already passed the point around 2009 where we're actually spending more than we're taking in. There's two estimates of when the insolvency happens, anywhere from 6 to 9 years from now, to where we run out of reserves. And here's what the law says. It says by law, you cannot pay more money out than is in the reserves. Once you run out of money, you stop paying out at that rate. So that means either we get paid less, or you're going to have to collect more taxes for it, whatever that is. This has to be solved. Otherwise, people are not going to be able to pay their bills. So I just kind of gave you a view, very high level, of what's happening federally and why it's critical that we do something about why DOGE is critical, why it's critical they start getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, first of all, and then stabilizing our financials. What I'm going to do is now just look a quick view of what's happening California-wise. This is something that's brought up by Kevin Kiley. He's been pretty sharp in reporting on stuff. So he brings up several points. California has the highest gas prices, but these funds continue to disappear, and they don't fix the infrastructure. That's going somewhere. California spent $22 billion on homeless. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the density housing. $24 billion on homeless. They've been audited twice. In both instances, they can't figure out where the money's going, yet they do nothing to fix it because they don't care about the homeless that they pretend to. So the funds continue to disappear while homelessness increases. And there's this thing called NGOs. I'll get to that in a second, because that keeps popping up everywhere, in California as well as the federal government. California paid out $22 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims, yet they've done nothing to fix it. So it's still happening. California has tripled its overall spending to keep us safe. That's right. In only 2 years, Newsom increased our spending by 30%. Further destabilizing our state. But yet, with all the money they get, they still cannot keep us safe by creating more water storage, which we passed bonds for, which were not spent on actually doing it, but the money was spent. Forest management, fire hydrant testing, talked about that, and sufficient staffing for fire and police. California has tripled the cost of education, yet the standards have been lowered and our children are less prepared to take care of themselves independently as well as compete internationally for our country. California has the most progressive tax structure. That means it varies the most between upper and lower tax earners, and yet we have the highest level of poverty and inequity. There's a correlation there because it's a pretense. Yet the people with a lot of money have ways to get out of it, which the laws allow them to. And California spent $17 billion on a high-speed rail, yet has not laid any track. These aren't accidents. Let's go to this word, NGO, non-governmental office. What is that? That's how we're being plundered. This is also a 501c3. This is also called a charity. Those are all the same terms. So these organizations are happening. If you've been watching anything on USAID, it all goes to NGOs. Why? Because no information is tracked after they receive it. They're not held accountable and the money disappears. Doing something nefarious or just putting it in their pocket. But whenever you see NGOs, it's probably a really bad thing because this is how it's happening. So a government can go ahead and give money to an NGO to get them to do something the government isn't legally allowed to do. And so that's why you see that coming up a lot. Why isn't there a correlation? A lot of what they're finding in DOGE, in my opinion, should be start writing that into laws so we permanently don't have these problems anymore and it aligns to the needs of the American people. We're basically being robbed of our future in California and we don't know what to do about it. One of it is we're trying to educate people and let them know what's happening and the means in which it happens. So California's fiscal state. This is just really high level, I'm not going into it too much. So we have reoccurring deficits even though we have the highest revenue ever. This isn't necessary. But unlike the federal government can print money, which is the whole inflation, devaluating, but California can't do that. So they have to run on reserves or they can take out debt, but they can't take out as much debt because they have to have enough to pay that interest. But they can play around with accounting tricks, which they do with their pensions. That's for another day. So what do they do when they don't have enough? They have to reduce services. They take on more debt, which further destabilizes. They can deplete their reserves and savings, and they can charge more taxes. As you can see, the whole tax thing seems to be popping up a lot. You need to do your fair share. Anyways, this information comes straight from the California Legislative Office. California has no plans to fix the cause of our instability, so our descent continues. And that's about it. Do you guys have any questions you'd like to ask? You're welcome. Thank you. Now that I've depressed you. One question here and then over here. Did you? Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on tariffs, whether you think they're good or bad?
I really like where Trump is going on these new ideas, and we need new ideas to overcome what's going on here. Tariffs are being hidden. Other countries charge us tariffs. We don't reciprocate. And it's being hidden two ways. Sometimes they're called tariffs, and sometimes it's layered in something called a VAT tax. You've got to consider both of those, because both of those affect us in the same way, where we try to sell something to another country, but they don't buy it because the cost has been bumped up by their own government. That's what a tariff does. In order for us to bring back manufacturing and things like that to our country, we have to invest in our country as well. And that's, you see him constantly talking about these new companies coming in and they're going to hire all these employees. That's what he's trying to do. But he's got to do that quickly so that, because there's a bump up where we would pay more for something from China before we can get the manufacturing here. But he's racing. He's doing a race right now to get that all in place. If done well, tariffs are a good thing, and I think that it's the way to go, but he needs to help people understand, because there's a lot of complexity behind that. And I think he's smart enough to do it well. He also does it as a way to negotiate, if you watch the dynamics. Trump is always negotiating. He's throwing an idea out there because he's trying to get somebody to come to the middle, or he's trying to get them to make a change, another kind of change. So part of what he's saying with that, he's negotiating. Other questions?
What are the checks and balances on our state? Like who checks them? Like who's checking all of this? Like the money that we're spending and how we're getting into debt. Who's checking the governor and the money that they're spending?
Okay.
Individual states.
And you're making the point too, and I'll tell you in a second, you're making the point that whatever it is not effective, and you're absolutely right. So you have media not reporting facts, right? You have the state auditor. The state auditor on what happened with the homeless audited it several years ago, like 2021, and said, hey, we can't figure out where this money's going. And yet the governor did nothing. So the auditor is just a reporting, but not an enforcement arm. And that's where we're lacking something. So we would expect and hope that our elected officials would step in and fix it, but they didn't. So there is no checks and balance for the enforcement arm, and we lack some reporting to the people about, because of our media has not been bringing that up. But you're right, the checks and balances are not in there that used to be there before.
Yes, but that almost leads me to think, would it be awesome if we had like a state IRS? So it was almost like a state IRS that would audit the California government and be like, right, where's this money? You know, now you're going to be fined and held accountable.
Yes, we need a California Doge. We need transparency. And as you know, that's something I always talk about, is transparency. If people knew the truth, you wouldn't have support to do bad things to them, right? And so what they do is they attack the truth teller. Right? Oh, they're extreme, they're this. I personally have been attacked for those reasons, even though I was reporting the truth. That's what happens with that marginalizing. And the more, at some point, and this, I'm hoping this is happening, in fact, I think it is happening looking at the newest polls, people like what Doge is doing, saving money, that kind of thing. The newest polls are showing that 60% of the people support this. So you've hit that critical line where you can't stop it now. You can't stop it. People are believing in it. But they still need to put that into laws, and they need to still hold some people accountable, and then it's going to be very hard to undo. But he knows if he doesn't do something in 4 years, if they get the wrong person in, they'll throw him in jail again, Trump. So he's in a race. Any other questions you want to ask?
I think everyone says that we need a Doge for California and LA County, but I don't.
Rick Grinnell.
But I don't think that our current elected officials would ever do something like that. It's got to be a grassroots movement. Have you had any thoughts about that? The presentation you just gave was great.
Thank you.
Not enough people are hearing about that, but it just seems like there's such an opportunity right now to get something going. Have you had any thoughts on what we could potentially do? Of course, we have the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. I'm part of an LA County Taxpayer Association. There's a lot of groups out there, but I think we need to find a way to get this information out there in Doge, California, and LA County. Have you had any thoughts about how to possibly do that?
I know how it can be done. I'm trying to figure out a pathway to it, but maybe you know. Here's my idea. Rick Grinnell. It's Rick Grinnell. He's our pathway. He is connected not far from Doge. He's been assigned by President Trump to do something on the fires. We haven't heard from him yet, but he was busy rescuing people in South America. He rescued some hostages. So he's been a little busy, but I think he's back. I believe he's in Manhattan Beach. I think that is what I've thought about, and I've thought about how to contact him because he would also be able to tap into Doge as well, and maybe those of us that are active, like yourself as well, doing the right thing, could offer some support in various ways. That's what I've been thinking about in my mind.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just another round of applause for Des.
Aw.
Seriously.
Aw,
She pulled this together, like she said, and she did it because she was my friend, but she also cares so deeply. And we want you to come back for the part 2 or part 3. Well, okay? All right.